and foremost, thanks for coming out on a Saturday to hear about Tezos. That's really cool. I usually take my Saturdays off, but that's okay. So, just a little bit of backstory, just because we are in the Bay Area where a lot of, I guess, the momentum that has culminated in what Tezos looks like today started here a few years ago. I remember the first meetup for Tezos was down in Sunnyvale. There were approximately 4 attendees, 2 of which had the last name Breitman. So it was a very humbling experience to actually see many more people on a Saturday, no less, come out to hear about all the great things that have happened in the ecosystem. So it's been a pretty wild ride. It's only been about 3 years that we've been kind of focusing on this full-time, and as you can imagine, it's rather humbling to go back to where we kind of started in Silicon Valley, but also go to places like South Korea, Japan, so on and so forth, and see people with whom, who have the whole vision of Tezos resonate with them. So thank you for all coming out and participating in the ecosystem. It's very humbling to see Stephen Andrews, hacking away without a peep in New Zealand, and to see go to other parts of the world and see equally enthusiastic folks. So today, as some of you guys may know, though I co-founded Tezos, the intention was always, once the ecosystem and indeed the network kind of got up and running, to work on the application layer in some sense. Arthur's still very devoted to working on the core of the protocol, but I've always been much more interested in business applications. And so my new company is called Kos. I have my pitch deck here. It's called The Nature of the Firm. It's funny because that's also the name of Ronald Coase's seminal work from 1930. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I'm up to and the general thesis behind it. I hope, and of course you can ask questions at the Q&A. So as has been made public before, what we're really focusing on with Kos is a digital collectible card game. So I'll go through that and kind of the market sizing for that. And then, smart contract platforms, why use Tezos in any part of this, and to what extent are you actually, do you actually need a blockchain if you do it all? And then I'll tell you a little bit about my thesis and where I'm moving forward. And as ever, I'd love to hear feedback and a little more about that. So geez, did anyone here play Magic the Gathering when they were a kid? Okay, so not that many, okay. So Magic the Gathering is kind of this phenomenon of the 90s and indeed 2000s. It was a first collectible card game, so much like all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, all of collectible card games are a footnote to Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is a CCG where you can basically play with your friends, and you collect cards, and you duel, and you battle. And it sounds quite quaint, but it actually is powered like a rather large multi-billion-dollar ecosystem. There's around 20 million Magic players worldwide, by some estimates. And as is the case with most internet-based things, there's a sort of an analog and a digital version of this. And so the digital versions of this have kind of taken the form of games like Magic Online, but also Hearthstone, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! All have apps in different types of styles that are derivative from Magic indeed. So the top 5 franchises in digital collectible card games have around 20 million players worldwide, about $1.5 billion in revenue. And it's a pretty compelling use case if you want something that is fundamentally very economically bankrupt, because in the efforts to digitize itself, it's completely failed. And so there's a pervasive issue in digital collectible card games that they suffer from a lack of marketplaces, and thus the cards that people are amassing are rather illiquid. It's not as much fun to play, and in fact, exploration, which made Magic so popular in the 1990s, has kind of failed in its digitized versions by a lack of marketplaces. Smart contract platforms obviously can introduce markets into rather illiquid digital goods. And so the idea with Kos is to basically introduce these marketplaces into a collectible card game format. Placing cards in a public network will kind of relinquish the rights of publishers to manipulate and indeed, facilitate a secondaries market. How does this tie into Kos, and why did I squat on this name? Well, geez, Ronald Coase is a Nobel laureate. He's most famous for his contributions to understanding transaction costs, that being things like the friction that we observe when we try to exchange goods with others, broadly construed. And so In the theory of the firm, which is Marlikos's most famous work, he observed that because marketplaces have fundamental inefficiencies, it's a lot of the actions that we have are better produced inside of some sort of corporate structure. Kevin Verbeck, who recently wrote a book on blockchain technology, observes that this can be interpreted as a commentary on the limitations of trust. So, when we think about blockchains through a Coastian lens, blockchains basically have the potential to lower transaction costs because they facilitate the sort of economic transfers that would normally be better inculcated in some sort of firm by basically allowing for a public network to register and validate transactions among potentially distrusting groups. In general, people trust the outcomes of blockchains because they trust the process by which they come to these conclusions, because it's all very public and open. And so I've named my company Coast because I hope to introduce these types of inefficiencies into an inefficient marketplace, that being, of course, collectible card games first and foremost, because the system is rather broken and the notions are rather fractured. Primarily, my goal as someone who has a vested interest in the success of the Tezos network is to create something that will increase demand for Tezos in hopefully an area that's a bit orthogonal to the traditional blockchain structure. I think that the cryptocurrency industry, though very exciting and interesting, fundamentally has an issue with growth if it doesn't have more pragmatic applications that use a cryptocurrency more passively in the background. And so we know when you look at the numbers for blockchain usage, they're rather scant. And when you look at most other rather centralized models, obviously you see many more orders of magnitude in usability and participation. And so if you take just a meager chunk of the magic market away by introducing a better economically oriented game, that's already many more users than most cryptocurrencies have today. So kind of the idea here is to sneak cryptocurrencies under the radar and in the back. I was at GDC, this big gaming conference in San Francisco this week, and I'm pleased to report that it was the first conference I've been to in a long time where I was a complete nobody, and no one knew who I was, and it was awesome. And so we're focusing on that primarily, and so ideally, we'll reap the benefits in the Tezos network in the next 4 to 5 years as we deploy a game and people play it without knowing that they're using Tezos passively. That's kind of my goal. I go into pitch meetings with VCs, and they're like, what do you think about, this being a blockchain company? I'm like, oh my goodness, I hope people don't realize that this is the case, right? That will be my marker of success. So that's basically what we're trying to do with Coast, kind of sneak this under the radar and put it in passively in the background. It's a kind of ambitious goal, but it's one that I think will reap the benefits just in terms of the sheer number of folks who are going to get involved. So yeah, I guess we'll probably cover more in the Q&A, but that's just the general overview of what I'm up to now. You'll probably see more from me the next few weeks as I publish a bit more about the game itself, but that's what I'm up to, and that's where my time is being spent now. So thanks very much, and I'm sure Melton will wake you up now that I put you to sleep.